Okay, guys, this is chapter 12 from Reading Between the Signs. It's entitled Interpreting in a Virtual World, but really the author just talks about the VRS settings, which could now be applied to VRI, but the author specifically just talks about video relay service. So she focuses on the cultural aspects of video relay service, not so much the semantics of it, if you will, how you plug in, what the setups look like. She focuses on the cultural implications for it. The book says that VRS calls are usually instigated by the deaf caller more often than the hearing caller, and that it can be really common for an interpreter, once they're connected with both consumers, to ask the hearing consumer, have you used video relay service before? Or do you have experience with an interpreted call? Which I thought was interesting. The video relay service and other VRI type environments are still leaning more towards a conduit model. And so that can affect what cultural mediation decisions are made. And then one of the challenges of VRS, albeit a small challenge, is the cubicle setup of it. You're in the same space in a more confined signing space, staring at a camera with a big screen and you have a headset on. Just some of those physical feelings of being in a cubicle on VRS can change how the interpreter themselves feels. These are just some general challenges you can face in VRS. And a lot of us are already familiar with many of these challenges because we experience them in a world of Zoom post-COVID, how we have been attending classes, 3D language, 2D screen. We know this, eye fatigue, bad connections. Just we're familiar with a lot of these things simply because we live in 2021. One of the, or a few of the VRS specific challenges can be voice activated menus if a deaf consumer is calling a phone tree service or a large organization. That menu of press 1 for, press 2 for, press 3 for, that can be difficult to convey. A VRS interpreter is not allowed to ask for information beforehand. So in the community, how you would have a waiting room chat, and you could ask, oh, is this your first time here? And kind of get some of that information from the deaf consumer. You're not allowed to do that in VRS, which can be challenging. Obviously, VRS, you get calls from everyone, almost everyone in North America. So there's a lot of multiculturalism happening, and that can be challenging for interpreters who aren't familiar with certain cultures. And while many phone calls can be very simple, there is the potential for very advanced content, conversations that rely heavily on jargon that you had no context for before accepting the call. Same with unfamiliar proper nouns. The school down the street from the deaf consumer, you're not going to know that sign for it. So it's going to be a little more difficult to convey. Okay, here is just an example of the context differences between a community and VRS interpreting. As you can see, it's very unbalanced. In community interpreting, you get the information from the agency when they set up the appointment. You get the information of driving there, seeing what neighborhood you're in, how far it is from your place. That kind of gives you a clue. When you arrive and the usually hearing staff's reaction to you, that gives you information and context. Any posters or information on the walls of the space you're interpreting in can give you context. Getting to physically see the hearing consumer, all of these things give you context that you just don't have in VRS. The only overlap of the two is really that you get to see the deaf consumer. And in VRS, unless you have every area code or phone number memorized, it can be really difficult to get any context before hitting the accept call button. Okay, the book divides most VRS calls into these two categories, which seems like a no-brainer: business and family calls. Because these are the two biggest categories, typically you get business calls during the day, during work days, 8 to 5 business time. And then family calls, in the past have been more oriented to nights and weekends, although now that can be changing just with the prolific nature of technology. Usually going into a VRS call, it can be difficult to determine what register to start in. So you can assume that you're having a business call and you set that register a little bit higher, and it can be until minutes later that you realize this is a family connection and you have to bring that register down to be more dynamically equivalent. So for business phone calls, it can be difficult to know for the deaf consumer when the deaf consumer should identify themselves. Deaf language, deaf culture depends a lot on high context. So getting to the point, how long you have to get to the point with a business phone call can be difficult. What background information is or is not required. When you're supposed to be saying thank you to the person on the phone who is, helping you with your annoying insurance problem, how often you should be saying thank you, that can be difficult. And then also the filing of a complaint process over the phone can be particularly challenging. With family calls, the biggest challenge that the book talks about is the fact that it's an intimate register. That's going to be the hardest register to interpret for because there's so much shared context and background that you can say one word and it instantly means something to the other person, but you as the interpreter have no clue what's going on. Again, proper nouns can be a really difficult thing to interpret from not in your community. The nature of the call, it can be a really simple surface chat, check-in, or it can be really deep and unsettling news. This is going on with dad, or your cousin just had this happen. It can be difficult. And family calls have a very high risk for vicarious trauma just because of those things that everyone who is a part of a family experiences. It can hit you while you're interpreting without warning because you don't have any context before you pick up the call. Some of the things that the book talked about is how to be an ally on VRS and through these phone conversations. They give an example of themselves interpreting a VRS call. The deaf consumer got the voicemail, so she is interpreting the voicemail message, leave your name and social security number at the beep. And the deaf consumer starts giving their social security number, and the interpreter decided to say it's not safe to do that. And other similar stories, deaf consumers have shared very similar stories of that it's not safe. The deaf consumers appreciate that. They call that deaf heart. That was the right thing to do, the right way to be an ally for the deaf community. As in all interpreting, but especially in VRS, mistakes are guaranteed to happen, and the deaf consumer respects when you own them, when you are honest and admit, I messed that up, let me fix it. And then learning how to gracefully ask for clarification through VRS can be a different skill set than in the community setting because there's more chances for miscommunication because of the integration of technology. The internet signal could be bad. The fire department could have just driven by and you couldn't even see what the deaf consumer was doing. There's more opportunities to ask for clarification. So knowing how to ask gracefully can be really important.